Okay. Well, friends, while our other friends are coming around, I want to first and foremost, well, I think before I apologize, I should welcome you. Welcome. It's wonderful to see you all again, and some of you for the first time for our learning sessions, which will occur again twice monthly on these Sundays, typically 2 p.m. to 3-ish will be our first class, what we do, and typically 3:15 to 4:30, depending on how long we go, will be our ideology and allegory class. I'm apologizing today because I've been asked to lead the Vesper service at Westminster, and that begins at 4 o'clock. So today we're going to go 2 to 3:45 or something like that, because they're right around the corner. But I will try to be with you.
Two classes, one for.
That's 2 classes that we're going to fit in.
So we're going to finish.
We're going to finish both, and I've developed it so that we can conquer the things we need to conquer today, so that next time we can start and you guys can get the full session that you deserve. So what we'll do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Does anyone need writing utensils? Because there is, I'm left things a little bit open to write down some things, and I'm more than happy to provide pens if necessary or anything like that. You'll notice that there are blank spots for you to take your own notes on this one. All right, hi Deb, welcome.
Did you give me one? Hey, I didn't take mine.
I got one, Jules. There you go. Easy peasy.
I need the other one.
All right, friends, I do want to get started because we are on a limited schedule today. So this class, to give you an overview briefly, throughout my, not just here, my tenure at West Lafayette, but as a rabbi, the main questions that we get these days are, what do we do as Reform Jews? Why have I seen conservative or Orthodox or Renewal or Reconstructionists or other Reform Jews or whatever it is do this? Why don't we do this? Why do we do this? These sort of questions, and I think they're very important questions. I think that as Judaism expands into these denominations and how denominations evolve and change, these are good questions to ask. And so this class will basically, throughout the year, try to conquer some of those big ones of what are the theological, ritual, liturgical choices that Reform Jews make in contrast with our other friends of other denominations. And right off the bat, there is no right, there is no wrong. Every denomination of Judaism chooses to understand things a certain way, chooses their heritage a certain way, focuses on certain things. So that's the first thing that I want to make right away. You don't hear it from us a lot, but if you are to hear what you guys do is wrong, well, that's not true. There's no such thing as right and wrong in terms of Jewish practice, in terms of from a denominational style. There are advisories that we can do, there are recommendations, there are ideas that are based upon texts that we hold as the majority or the minority, but a great deal goes more into that. So that's really going to be the goal of this class. Yes, Jules?
Well, just like question. In the U.S. today, I don't know, there are about 10 million Jews or something like that. How many are Reformed? How many are
So Reform Judaism is the largest denomination in the U.S. I think, I don't know the percentage of it, but we are large and we are growing. The Orthodoxy is a small amount, but it is growing because of the Chabad movement, but it is something like 10, 15% or something. It's very small in comparison. Conservative Judaism has, over the last 5 years, shrunk significantly, exponentially, and the scholars forecast that it may not even exist in the next 5 to 10 years. That is because of many things that we will talk about, including the fact that Reform Judaism, in terms of its reclaiming tradition, looks a little bit more like conservative Judaism, and Orthodoxy and modern Orthodoxy starts to go into that side of conservatism. So they're sort of being pulled at both ends. People finding joy at Reform and people finding it in modern Orthodoxy and not in the middle so much anymore. I don't know the percentages, But
Now, when you speak of orthodoxy, the Hasidic groups, they would be.
so there's modern Orthodoxy. They have their own their own sects, right? So there's modern Orthodoxy, which is the most, I would say, liberal of the denominations, right? They're working on women reading Torah. They're working on LGBTQ things as much as they can. And then there are what we would call the ultra-Orthodox denominations, Hasidic, Haredim, Chabadnik, those sort of things. But it's okay to group those, unless we're going really into their specific understandings, to group them in a particular denomination, because they are a very, very tradition's a hard word. I would say observant aspect of Judaism. But it's a good question. Yes, Beth?
So would I be wrong in saying that my understanding is the one commonality that all Judaism has is our understanding of Jesus and our non-belief in Jesus as
You know, that's an interesting way to put it.
the Savior.
That's an interesting way to put it. You know, I've thought about this, and in terms of how do you define the commonality between Judaism, and the reason why we can't go around the idea of one God is because there's humanistic Judaism who doesn't actually believe in God. There's cultural Judaism and secular Judaism. So that's not something. So I have heard this before, Beth, that the best way to describe the commonality between Judaism throughout the world is what we are not, right? No Jewish denomination acknowledges Jesus in any way theologically. So I suppose that would be a commonality to focus on. I'd prefer there be a commonality in the positive rather than the negative.
Right.
But maybe throughout our discussions, we'll explore one.
What about Reconstructionists?
Reconstructionists?
Is that Reform?
It's another denomination.
Totally
Different
And
denomination.
that's the one that may or may not accept one God, I mean, may or,
No.
getting them all mixed up.
Don't worry, and we're going to cover all of this. We're
Okay.
going to talk about all the other denominations. Reconstructionists and Renewal are very newer denominations. But what's really important to get through today is before we talk about who does what and the why and that sort of stuff, it's really important that we back up into the basis of what separates Reform Judaism, and maybe not even separates, what distinguishes Reform Judaism from other denominations. And so if you open up your paper here, what I want to mention, what I have written there is there is no better or more accurate word to summarize the state of religious practice in today's North American Reform movement. Each congregation or community in the Reform movement charts its own course in Jewish living. Okay? Each community, each congregation charts its own course. Each makes its own decisions on worship, on organization, business, Shabbat celebration, life cycle events. No one's community's decisions, and this is important, no one's community's decisions in the Reform movement are binding on another. Meaning that whatever the Reform movement, Reform temple does down the street is not binding on us, and vice versa, if there was a Reform temple down the street. There isn't, of course. Neither the movement nor its rabbis attempt to enforce a uniform standard of religious observances. That's really important because that is very different from our Orthodox friends, okay? My job as a rabbi is not to enforce that there is one way to do Reform Judaism. That is not the purpose of our movement. It's not the standard that we try to do. In that way, each community then exercises what we would understand as an independence in matter of practices, an autonomy in that way. Now, one more thing. We cannot identify a single standard or single way of performing any particular ritual or ethical practice as the correct standard for Reform Jews anywhere. In other words, you can't say all Reform Jews do this. There's no such thing. Maybe a great deal of Reform Jews, the majority of them do it. Maybe a great deal of congregations are doing it. But there's no such thing as saying, this is it, this is the line in the sand. And we'll talk about how that has been beneficial and how it has been challenging when a movement does not draw lines in the sand. I want to mention, of course, on the other side of this, is that Reform congregations and communities strive to ensure the religious practices are unmistakably Jewish in style, in substance. We do not simply just come up with stuff to do. We do not think that's nice, we should do it. We root our decisions that they are Jewish in tradition, that they are Jewish in style. Even though every Reformed community is free to make its own decisions, there is no, we're unencumbered by authority. There's no one, Rick Jacobs in the URJ is not going to say you have to do this, right? That being so, we do not define our particular movement as an all brand new, shiny new religion, lacking any real connection to Jewish tradition. Perhaps we've heard this from time to time, that Reformed Judaism has no connection to Jewish tradition. That is quite frankly false. Reformed Judaism, when it was founded, and Reformed Judaism today, is not as radical a break from tradition as others would have you believe. It is deeply rooted in tradition. The choices that it has made certainly may differ from other denominations, but it is deeply rooted in Jewish text and Jewish substance. So within that way, we would be able to say that all Reformed Jewish practices, whether they are the same or they are different, do follow a certain line back to the sources, back to the texts, back to our rabbinic heritage, meaning any decision that I come to the Paul Committee about or come to the board about is not something that Rabbi Mike came up with, right? It stems from the rabbinic heritage that we are aware of. It stems from a textual, what we might call a proof text, a textual source, something to support it from Jewish tradition. It doesn't come out of a vacuum, okay? And that's really important in terms of Reformed practice, in terms of Reformed theology, is that it doesn't come out of nowhere. In fact, our earlier discussion, Beth, about what we are and what we are not, this is important too. We should not define Reformed Judaism in the negative, that we are not Orthodox, right? We do not do that, right? We don't keep kosher, right? That's just not true. We do things that are our own choice, deeply rooted and thought about in Jewish texts and Jewish sources. Questions so far? Okay, let's keep going. If you turn the page. This is important, and I think we have talked about it from time to time. It does come up. When we talk about modern day Judaism, okay, we're talking about Judaism that has evolved out of what is the rabbinic creation, okay? The Judaism that exists in the Torah is not the Judaism we practice today. The Judaism that exists in the prophets and the writings is not the Judaism that we practice today. The Judaism of the first temple and the second temple are not the Judaism that we practice today. The Judaism that we practice today is firmly based in the 5 centuries of the rabbinic period. This is the first 5 centuries of the Common Era, 1 through 5, so up to 5th century CE. In those 500 years, when the Mishnah and the Midrash and the Talmud were all being constructed and codified, that is deeply the root of all modern Judaism, even the ultra-Orthodox, okay? Certainly we believe that the Bible is the founding document of Judaism. We can't possibly escape from that. We read the Torah, all the time. It is our central text. But how we practice, how we interpret it, is based so heavily on the rabbinic period. It would be inaccurate to say that anything that we do is based on Torah practice, Bible practice, that sort of stuff. What we do is based upon the thought and the writing and the arguments of those who took those texts and believed a certain thing about those texts and then moved forward. That's why, even though the Torah is this long, the Talmud is 40 volumes long and huge and takes up the whole library because there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to make the Torah and the Tanakh relate to that particular society, including modern day society, and that's exactly what the rabbis were trying to do. The ancient Israelite religion is what we would call the Judaism of the Torah. The truth is, Jews are not the right way to describe the people in the Torah. Judaism, as we talked about last year, comes from the idea of Judah, comes from the idea of when it actually became a religion rather than what it was, a cultic practice, a tribal understanding. This Israelite religion, which involved sacrifices, it involved tribal laws, it involved those sorts, and their own theologies and things like that, have since evolved into modern day Judaism. The rabbis during these first 5 centuries, meaning within the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash from 1st to 5th century CE, they took that biblical religion, and it had, of course, sacrifices, purity rituals, agricultural festivals, and they took those aspects that were no longer relevant to where Judaism was in those periods, and they translated it into institutions that we identify now as Jewish. In other words, I like to call the rabbis of the 5th century the first Reform Jews. What they did is they took the things that were irrelevant or morally different or things that did not work from a Israelite biblical religion, and they translated into a way that they could practice it, that they could honor those traditions and honor those commandments. If that makes sense. Good. Yes, George.
I've heard Orthodox Jews proclaim they're halakha Jews.
Halakhic, we're going to get into that word in
Okay,
just a
okay,
moment.
okay.
Thank you. We're going to get into that word. In fact, my next note is about halakha. So thank you, Jules. Thank you, sir. Okay. Halakha, okay, which, by the way, you will see this a lot. Halakha, okay, literally means the way. But when we are talking about it from this point of view, we're talking about Jewish law. Okay? Halakha, without halakha, without this idea of halakha, there would not have been Judaism. It would not have come along in that way. Halakha is an idea that comes from the rabbinic period. Before we talk about a little bit more about its influence and its weight, and I think throughout the year, Jules, we will be discussing halakha in depth because there's a certain way about that. But in general, to be halachic and follow halakha means you are following the rabbinic laws that have now, 2,000 years later, become Jewish law in certain denominations, right? When they say, you know, kashrut, I follow halakha. Well, they're not following the kashrut of the Torah. They're following what the rabbis say on the kashrut of the Torah. That's the halakha. Does that make sense? And the rabbis created in these majority opinions and these things that then people took out and and the way that you build a law code is you talk about it first. Well, the Talmud is them talking about it. And then after, you get into things as late into the 16th century as what's called Shulchan Aruch, which a lot of the Orthodox Jews say, that's it, that's halakha, that's what we do no matter what. But it didn't come in a vacuum. It came out of that way. That's their branch. Ours came out a completely different branch. Okay? Really important is the Reform movement has, since its beginning in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, has taken an active role, active participation in the conversation of Jewish law. We have not separated ourselves from Jewish law. We have not said we don't follow Jewish law. We have been really, really into that idea. There was no drastic rejection of authority of Jewish law in Reform Judaism. That is not who we are. I'm trying to show you the things that you might hear, right? That and I hear them all the time, okay? Right? You've rejected halakha. Well, that's not true at all. We just think about it differently, right? You've rejected Jewish law. Actually, not at all. If you study our stuff, ours is based in Jewish law, that kind of thing. Our forms and our religious practice, meaning ours, our Reform practices, the rituals that we do, no matter what they are rabbinic and halachic in nature, all of them. The way we pray, the way we do things, they are rabbinic and halachic. Again, they don't come out of a vacuum, okay? So where does it come from then? How do we find out what we do and what we don't do? It is, what we have here written is the word responsa, okay? Responsa comes from the idea of when there were Jewish institutions throughout the world with head rabbis and houses of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai and Beit Akiva, and a normal Jew living in Babylon or living in Persia would write and say, I don't know what to do about this. Here where I live, this is this. What do I do about it? They would write a question, and they'd send it to this authoritative rabbi, and the rabbi would give a responsa, a responsum, right? A response to it, right? And say, this is what we do. in that situation. That is the continuation of the conversation that the rabbis were having in the Talmud. The Talmud codifies it and it's written down. If you want to read about any conversation that was had between the 1st and the 5th century, it's there. But conversations continued. So we need to have, well, there are things that appear that were not present in the 1st century, 2nd century. Modern technology, for instance, right? Light bulbs and toilets and cars and all these sort of things. So you need an answer, right? The world changes, and so you need a new response to that, okay? There is what's called Reform Responsa, and you can Google it, and it's open to everybody. There are books of it, and there is an online record of it through the CCAR. And the people who answer these responsa are some of the most highly trained rabbis in the field. They sit on the boards of the CCAR Responsum Committee, and they analyze these questions, and they base them in text. You will see, if you open up a page of responsa, you will see a question, and then pages and pages and pages and pages of an answer. There's no such thing as an easy answer in Judaism, right? You have to know, okay, well, here's what you're asking, here's what it might mean, here's if you do this, and here's why we do this, right? So I certainly encourage you to check that out. But most importantly about responsa, that differentiates them from the old responses in medieval times or that sort of thing, is that these are not authoritative, okay? There is no, what we would call Rebbe in Reform Judaism. You'd hear that term from the Chabad point of view. He's the one guy that you would ask, and what he says, that's it. That's authority, right? Now, obviously, the Rebbe was brilliant and amazing, but we do not have that structure, that hierarchical structure, okay? There is no Reformed Jewish Pope who has the final word. There are those who are trained in Reform Judaism, and those provide us the best answer that we can get. In other words, it's not really about authority here. Authority versus not authority. A rabbi doesn't have any authority. It's about the scholar and the non-scholar. Who knows more and can give you the better answer? That's what Reform Judaism is based on, right? And it makes sense. If you want the best answer, you get to the person who has studied that much, much more than you, right? That's why we go to doctors for medical, right? The doctor's not authoritative. He or she can give you the advisory based on their knowledge. That's exactly the same way that Reform rabbis work. So they're not binding. They're not obligatory, meaning that if you go to the CCAR responsive page, you might say some things that we do, some things that we don't do, some things that we kind of do, or whatever it is. Our responsive don't claim authority because we do not regard halakha, Jewish law, as a process that yields mandatory conclusions. There's nothing that we say is mandatory. Even belief in God is not mandatory. We can advise you as to how to be the best Reformed Jew you'd like to be, but that's about all we can do. In Reformed Judaism, religious decisions are arrived at, as I said, by individuals or communities, right? There can be a congregation who says, I know this is what the URJ says, I know this is what the rabbis say, but we as a congregation decide differently. They take into, at least they take into account all of the factors that seem relevant within Judaism and then choose accordingly. This is what we like to call that wonderful thing that we're going to hear so many times, right? Informed choice. That first part is super important, okay? Reform Judaism just doesn't do whatever you want. I like it. I think I'll eat shrimp, right? That's not how it works, okay? An individual, hopefully based on the help from a rabbi or whoever is the scholar, some communities don't have a rabbi, whoever's the most scholarly person in that community, helps you with this part, helps you with making the information to say, I want to give you all the information or things like that you can work on, and then you decide what's relevant, what's appropriate, but all of that information is based in Jewish law, okay?
I'm laughing at your example because we had shrimp for dinner last night.
That's delicious, okay?
I come clean.
And we will talk about kashrut this year.
But we don't eat pork.
Okay. So on the reverse side, when we say that communities or individuals take into account all those factors, the decisions are not imposed upon individuals or communities from the outside, we'd say, right? There's no outside force that says, well, you have to do this. Rabbis, you should do this, or you have to do this. Lay leaders, you have to do this, right? There is a hierarchy, so to speak, of experience and scholarship. Whereas I, as a rabbi, sometimes have to reach up to someone who is much more scholarly or experienced than me to get an answer to a new question, right? Lay leaders go to the URJ sometimes, right? Sometimes to say our community is having this issue, what have you done in your experience? And that's what the URJ is for, to do
But
that.
you know what they say?
Ask your rabbi.
No, do what you want to.
I know.
We don't tell you what to do.
I know.
Believe me, been there, done that.
Yeah, we'll talk about the problems of the URJ later, but
Okay.
in theory, that is its purpose,
Yeah.
right? In theory, that is its purpose. But with the absence of that in the URJ, you ask the rabbi, what do you think we should do? And the rabbi goes up and asks, unless they know it. Sometimes they do know stuff. So responsa in general are, again, advisory. If you say, we want to go to, as a community, go to the Bacon Festival here in Lafayette, right? Well, we'd have to talk about what we would advise you to do from a rabbinic point of view, from a Jewish point of view, from a textual point of view, and then it's up to you to decide if that's going to be your field trip or not, okay? When we say this, that it's advisory, this doesn't mean that we're neutral or impartial to decisions that our people ultimately reach. It doesn't come out of a vacuum. It's not sort of whatever ambiguousness about it, right? In theory, and mostly in practice, you do things because you have been informed as to how things work and what are the most relevant to you from a Jewish point of view. There is nothing that comes up in a Jewish board meeting that says, who cares what Judaism says about it? We just want to do it. That's not a Jewish board, right? The temple board has an obligation to follow what is best for the congregation through the lens of Jewish law. Just advisory, right? Not everything is going to apply, and some things may work or not, but it has to be through that lens. Otherwise, they lose their Jewish identity. So a responsum, which is responsa in singular, is to recommend a particular decision for you to consider, the people who ask that question, for them to consider it. And it's up to you. It's an argument. I can make a great argument why you should do this or why you should do that, right? It's a reasoned attempt to justify a particular course of action. Out of, typically, there are many plausible alternatives. Alternatives, not right or wrong. There are plausible one or two, maybe three alternatives to go about it. And so the argument from responsa from a rabbi is to say, based on Jewish understanding, I think this is what you should do. And that's how the Reform movement works. That's how it filters down from the CCAR and the URJ. Each rabbi in each congregation makes a certain decision that is right for them. Reform congregations in New York have different challenges than those in California, than those in Indiana and Michigan and Texas. There's going to be things that they're going to do differently than we're going to do. We can say, hey, there's a great, very successful, synagogue in New York, and they have 5,000 members. Maybe we should listen to them. Well, not really. They're in their own sort of situation here. We need to decide what's best for our congregation through the element of Jewish law. Okay? Make sense? Good? Doing good? Okay, good. We're going to, for the first time, put ourselves next to orthodoxy, because that's the best way to distinguish ourselves in this way at this point, okay? We as Reformed Jews don't identify halakha, meaning Jewish law, the way as a set of crystallized rules, whereas orthodoxy does. Or they either do this is the crystallized rule, or this is a consensus opinion among rabbis, like the Orthodox. Meaning that there could be 100 rabbis in the highest levels of Reform Judaism who say this is the right way, but they can't tell you this is what you have to do in order to be a Reformed Jew. In order, there is typically one or many, a group of rabbis who will say, this is it. This is what you have to do. We're telling you what to do. This is the authority on that. And if you don't do that, then no, you're not being a Jew. Okay? We have seen that effect ripple to us. Okay? If in terms of Israel, we're not even recognized in certain places, right, as Jewish, because the things that we decide to do not correspond with the opinion, the consensus opinion by the Orthodox rabbis. Okay? For us, for Reformed Jews, this conversation just can't be brought to a premature end by a formal declaration, such as the Orthodox do. Okay? This is the law, you will hear the Orthodoxy say. You'll never hear that from us. All conflicting answers are wrong is something you'll hear from the Orthodox. You will not hear that from Reformed Judaism. That is a big, big difference. In terms of when we look at the Talmud and rabbinic period of Jewish law, there is always a majority opinion and a minority opinion. One of the beautiful things that the rabbis did in these rabbinic works was that they kept the minority opinion. They wrote it down, right? They didn't write down the majority opinion and say, forget the rest. They wrote down all the other parts of the argument because even in Orthodoxy, maybe one day the majority opinion doesn't work anymore. Opinion should be the first place we look. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Maybe this one works better for us. Maybe you can go back to the sources and find that another rabbi or conversation took care of this. Okay? So we hold that the minority opinion in halachic literature or new readings of the old texts, right? When we say new readings of the old text, we mean with science, archaeology, logic, philosophy, all these sort of things may offer a persuasive interpretation of Jewish tradition that might not fit with the accepted halachic ruling. If someone tells you that the earth is 6,000 years old, that's fine if they want to believe that. We can present to you another persuasive interpretation based upon archaeology, science, whatever it is. Okay? Reformed Judaism, therefore, asserts our rights of independence and halakhic judgment. We always reach a decision in the idea of Jewish law and the name of Jewish law. But we very frequently will depart from what we would call the orthodox position. We depart from it. Instead, we do something that makes the best Jewish religious sense to us. What makes sense to us? Based on all the information, right? That's the important part. What makes sense for us? What makes sense for Temple Israel, Reformed Jews in 2018? Now, here, right? What makes the best sense? And that may differ very much so from our Orthodox friends who do not take those points into consideration, okay? The idea of, and we'll talk about these sort of things, the idea of the division of men and women, the roles of men and women in Orthodoxy. We have abandoned those, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about those because it does not make the best Jewish religious sense to us. There are some who will call us a liberal Jewish community. I'm not thrilled about that, considering how politically charged the word liberal is these days. We need to find a new word. But what that word is trying to say, right, is that we see Torah as a source of religious truth. We can't exist in the absence of Torah, especially the essential moral and ethical commitments, but we can talk about them. And we can have discussions and elaborations on the theological arguments in the writings of prominent religious thinkers. That's what makes us liberal, so to speak. right, versus a conservative Jew or a, I don't know, Orthodox Jew. I like progressive, I like reform,
Yeah.
right?
Progressive is pretty charged right now.
I agree. Again, that's not our fault, but reform really encapsulates what that is. We're not reformed yet, right? We will always reform. We are always in the present because the world is changing all around us. There is no end game to this. Or we say we're reformed, we made it. Well, next year things are going to change, so we have to keep reforming. So that's really where we would put that there. Before we go into some examples, that's a lot of information, that's a lot of basis, and that's important because when we're going to study together about these things specifically, I want you to have this kind of basis to understand where it's coming from, okay? Any questions that, and there's no such thing, yes, as bad questions, so yes.
I guess all of this, the one part of me is like, yeah, that makes sense,
Uh-huh,
that's how things are. The other part of me does that whole thing of tradition.
Mm.
And I, things that I do because it was tradition and,
Yeah.
that always catches me because there isn't a logic to it. But it was there, it was tradition. And I like tradition, I need tradition. So I'm kind of playing with the adjustment of life and how things have adjusted with tradition. And that's something I wrestle with even as a lot of the movements are going on, But it's just, so that's just.
That's a great point to make, Ann, because that's a big word, tradition. And I want to make sure that we understand what it means, right? There are certain things that are tradition in Judaism. Certain things that work still today as tradition, right? The difference between tradition from Fiddler on the Roof and tradition from us, right, is we don't scream it, first of all, at people and say, this is it, you can't do anything else. The fact that we have done it for this long is not reason enough to keep doing it. The why behind tradition is important. And the reason why, Jan, is because I think it's wonderful if you find meaning in tradition. But there may come a point where you guys say, well, why do you do this? And you say, we don't know. Well, then the action in itself might carry some meaning. But the why and the origin and all that conversation needs to continually happen. This was a tradition that we did because of this. We now carry that tradition on. We reclaim that tradition, but through this new lens. That's exactly what Reform Judaism does, right? Tradition is not lost, right? And that's an important distinguishing, right? The story that I'll tell you on the other side, which will help you, is that there's a story about a congregation who every time, well, let me start over. There's a congregation that hires a new rabbi, and the rabbi is told that when they do the Aleinu, when they open up the ark, they're supposed to bend down and walk like this for 3 steps before going up. It's their tradition. It's their culture to do it. And the rabbi says, okay, great. Does anyone know why we do this? And they ask the oldest person in the congregation, and the guy says, I don't know. We ask somebody else. They don't know. They ask the predecessor, the old rabbi from 50 years ago. He's still alive. And they say, why do we do that? And he said, well, in our old building, the everlasting light hung down, and I was too tall.
Oh.
And I went like this and did it. And that's why. You see the difference?
Yes.
It's tradition. It's what we do. They didn't know it was because the rabbi was too tall. Okay? That's not what we want. We want you to say, I'm reclaiming this tradition, and I know exactly why. Right? And we have these conversations at Learner's Minion all the time, right? When I propose a suggestion or a different way to pray differently, right? I want you to reclaim that tradition, and I want to tell you why, right? So that's an important thing, and we will continue to discuss tradition throughout this class. It's a big, big loaded word. Okay, good. Yes.
But I think the point that you made that's important is that we haven't thrown out all tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Because I agree with you, there's some that we do Hakafah, we do
Right.
Bar and Bat Mitzvah, we do
Right.
Mazel Tov and Siman Tov at the end. There are a lot of traditions that we still very much
I agree, and I think it's important always to distinguish the word tradition from custom, right? There are customs that are not based in Jewish law. They're customs based on you, on Temple Israel, who say, you know what, we do it. We like it. That's not tradition, right? Even if you've been doing it for 100 years, it's not tradition, it's custom. Tradition is based in Jewish text. It's based in Jewish law. It's based within the realm of
okay.
halakha. Does that help?
I never heard it defined that.
Okay, yeah, so that's really important. And people use those words interchangeably all the time, so it's confusing, right? People say, we've been doing this for 50 years, it's tradition. It's a custom, but it's not tradition. Jewish tradition is based from the 1st to the 5th century in rabbinic period. That's where Jewish tradition is based, right? The interpretations of our Torah. Tradition has been, and I think mostly it is the fault of Fiddler on the Roof, it's become this wonderful word that means this is us, this is what defines us, this is what keeps us who we are, which is true. But it is not bending down to miss the ark, okay? Okay,
Miss the line.
that is our custom, okay, if that makes sense. So I want to give you some examples really quick that distinguish us from orthodox ideas of halakha, and we will talk about these in great detail throughout the year, but very, very briefly. No problem. Reform Judaism, as I put, is committed to gender equality. Oh, goodness. And here's what we mean when we're committed to gender equality. Our history, meaning Jewish history, teaches us that ancient distinctions between the ritual roles of men and women. When we say ancient, I want to make sure that we mean some of them are still done today, so it's not ancient in that they're gone. Ancient and orthodox distinctions between the ritual roles of men and women are no longer justifiable on religious, moral, or social grounds. And we will reject any such distinctions in our responsive process. We reject that outright. We affirm instead that moral equality does exist throughout, and ethical equality exists throughout the genders. There's not one or the other. And this goes into the next example, which is we involve humankind in our moral equality. Okay? Really important when we're talking about Jew and Gentile here. Okay? In Orthodox Judaism, there are things that are focused on Jews only and not applicable to Gentiles. Right? For better or for worse. Okay? That is because our Bible, our Tanakh, and the rabbinic literature do restrict the field within the moral concern of the people of Israel. Meaning that our neighbor, our fellow, or our brother is always a Jew, not a Gentile. When it says love your neighbor, the subtext, according to the Orthodoxy, is love your Jewish neighbor. Okay? Right? It's your Jewish brother or sister, right? Not a Gentile. But we, as Reformed Jews, do not share this view. Now, we will distinguish between Jews and non-Jews in the acts of ritual behavior, meaning that we don't expect Gentiles to do things that we do, right? We have rituals that are different from them. That's not something that we do. What we do, however, is that we call upon those texts that regard human beings, all human beings, as children of God, and that all human beings, Jew or Gentile, are entitled to justice and righteousness and compassion from us. That is a very different view, okay? We can say that a non-Jew is not obligated to say the Shema in our house of worship. If they want to, they can, but they're certainly not obligated to, right? There are certain ritual rules that apply to us that don't apply to Gentiles. But in terms of moral conduct, we reject that. Everyone is under the same idea of moral conduct. We believe that the standards of ethical behavior apply to dealings with Gentiles as well as with Jews. When we say love our neighbor, we mean our neighbor, whoever it is, whatever they are, That's our neighbor. If we are to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, it's not just Jews, right? If we're to be a light unto the nations, right? If we're to take care of those within Tikkun Olam, it's not just within our own space, okay? This is a differing view from certainly the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox focus very, very highly on the Jewish world. And their understanding is that basically Jews have been the subject of destruction for so long, we have to revitalize it, we have to focus on us, but that it creates an isolating sort of situation in that way, which Reform Judaism does not share. Reform Judaism is based on being part of a larger universe, right? Being part of a country of people who are Jews and not Jews alike. We exist in those places. We no longer exist in the shtetl, separated, whether it's our choice or theirs. A story that would help you distinguish that would be that when I was in St. Thomas, and I was very good friends with the Chabad rabbi, he's a wonderful man, he asked if we'd like to do a Tikkun Olam, social justice, social action mitzvah project, right? He asked we should do a mitzvah project together. That was his words. Well, as a Reformed Jew, I said, great, we love mitzvah projects. We got to go out and do all this stuff. What's your ideas? And his idea was to raise funds to make sure that every Jew has a mezuzah on his door. That was the scope of mitzvah within the Jewish world. My idea of mitzvah was to go out and feed people, right? One's not right or wrong, but you understand the different perspective. Good, okay.
Most of the ultra-Orthodox Jews who live, for instance, in Crown Heights or Williamsburg in New York, I don't think they even interact with non-Jews very much.
Typically, no. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
For business, perhaps. If you're selling diamonds, you'll certainly take the money from the Gentile. But for the most
Maybe
part,
so.
they
But
don't-
yes, they distinguish
they
themselves
really are
in their own
very
community.
cloistered, yeah.
And that is because it is based on an idea, for so long we have been independent communities, so long we have ruled ourselves, right, in that way. So a few more examples before we end on this aspect and move into our next class. Reform Judaism, and I think if you've been here with me throughout the year, you've known that I feel very strongly about this. The idea of religious innovation and creativity are really, really important. We're not only just open to that possibility, we desire it. The world is always changing, and we've got to change with it. We have to innovate. There are new ways to do it and to be creative. We do not believe that existing forms of religious observance are necessarily the only correct forms of observance from a Jewish perspective. I want to emphasize that, okay? There are rituals that exist and have existed for a long time. That does not mean that they are correct. That doesn't mean they're the right ones. The things that your grandparents did aren't necessarily the things that are right for us now. Some of them are. Some of them still work. That's awesome. Some of them don't. And we're open to that point of view. Tradition permits us instead to adopt ritual and ceremonial expressions that serve our, what we would call religious consciousness, better than those inherited from the past. So you'll see me flinch when everyone says, yeah, but we've always done this. The fact that you inherit something doesn't necessarily give it meaning, right? It's nice, it's comfortable, but there are new ritual and ceremonial expressions that serve us better today in 2018, and we should be open to them. That's what Reform Judaism believes. There is so much in terms of the orthodoxy about, we've been doing this for 1,000 years, doesn't that have meaning? It does, if the ritual itself still carries meaning beyond the fact that it's old. Okay, hooray, it's been 1,000 years, that's awesome. Does it still matter? Does it still relevant? And if it is, keep doing it. Great. If there's something else we can do based on the law, based on that practice and Jewish law, then we should probably come up with a better one. I want to make it clear that when we say innovation and creativity, this is not an invitation to anarchy. Okay? That is why we have responsa literature. We will only innovate in accordance with the basic guidelines of our tradition, where it defines and structures our worship and our rituals. Meaning innovation comes from informed choice. It comes from that same basket of laws and rituals that the old ritual came from. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Innovation in Reform Judaism is done, I think, in my opinion, and must be done carefully and respectfully, because the idea of abandoning religious practice without a good reason is a terrible idea. Again, that's why I said in the beginning, it's not what Rabbi Mike wants, okay? It's Rabbi Mike suggesting to you that based on the knowledge that we have, this might work. Maybe we can try it. We do not abandon tradition for no good reason, ever. There always has to be, just as there is a reason to create a new tradition, the meaning is held in the reason why. You have to have a reason if you're going to say we're not doing this anymore. You got to give me a good reason, right?
And conversely, if we say, we've always done it that way, and you flinch,
Yeah.
either way, we've always done it, it does still have meaning and resonates for this congregation.
If it does, it does,
Yeah.
right? What I always want you guys to do is think about the why behind it. What was the reason, to make sure that you're not doing what the rabbi in the story did, bending down and walking 3 paces
Right,
for the wrong
right,
reasons.
Right.
I want you to know why you're doing what you're doing. That's where the meaning is, right? I'm sure I do things that my grandparents did. That's nice. But the meaning is, why did they do it? Does that apply to me? If so, great. Let me carry forward that meaning. That's awesome. That's what tradition is about. That's how tradition lives and Judaism lives on. So our responsa will not say no to new ideas because they're new or because they depart from familiar forms of practice. Okay? We as Reformed Jews do reserve the right to decide when traditional halakha approaches do not fit. We have that right to say, you know, it says this, but that doesn't fit. It doesn't carry meaning for us anymore. Even the most liberal interpretations of the text and sources yield answers that conflict with our moral and religious commitments as liberal Jews. We will modify them. If someone says this is what Reformed Jews do, and it's liberal, and it's crazy, crazy liberal, whatever that means, if it doesn't work, we'll reject it. It's not about getting far this way or far that way. We'll modify those interpretations in favor, always, of those that better reflect our religious mind and our religious heart. Does that make sense? Good. Questions on what we have spoken about today, about what we do? Yeah, Jen.
Go ahead.
So it doesn't give us the flexibility to say, oh, I'm going to believe in more than one God, but it gives us the flexibility on how we approach Zionism.
Sure. Zionism is not a particular one rooted in, right? So, well, let's use your first example, right? You can't say, you know what, I think there's 2 gods. We should believe in 2 gods. That's not rooted in Jewish tradition, right? Monotheism is a central component. You can't escape that. Now, you might think differently about the role of God in the world, right? Is God all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, or not, right? Is God, are you a deist, right? Are you agnostic, right? What is God's role in your particular life? You do have the flexibility based on the Jewish understandings, of course, right? We don't want you to take them from everywhere else, right? But everything has a central component that then you can play with, so to speak, right? In an informed way. Does that make sense? Good.
And what about circumcision?
Circumcision is one of those topics that come up. It's a hot topic, right? There are arguments today that were not there back then, right? And again, the reason that Jews have always done it is not good enough, right? The basis for it in the Torah, what it represents, that's the suggestion as to why we would do it, right? If you have an argument where you do not want to do it, Okay, we'll hear your argument. But if we were to make a community-wide decision that no baby was going to be circumcised again, we better have that rooted in Jewish law if we were going to do that. It can't just be because we don't like it.
Would there be
Right.
many Jewish babies that weren't circumcised?
Not really. The best example I can give you in terms of the, when people talk about how, you know, it's a hot topic and genital mutilation, all that sort of stuff on that side, is during the Hellenistic period when we were under Greek rule, Jews would go under surgery to uncircumcise themselves to participate in the Olympic Games. So it's been on both sides of the aisle, right? That was highly frowned upon, but they did it, right? So we can certainly discuss it in detail. I think we might about what we feel about it and the ritual of it all. To give you an example, there are two things we're talking about in terms of circumcision: the ritual in terms of the actual physical act, and then the liturgy and the ritual around it. Right? When do you do it? What do you say? What does it represent? Who does it? Those sort of things are the ideas. Okay? Okay, any other questions before we move forward?
Mark, is
Yes.
there any things, you've been here since, what, August last year?
July 2017.
Okay. Have you changed anything?
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
I've changed many things. Many things.
Because you're the only rabbi I know, so, you know, I just think that this, I could easily say, well,
Right.
we've always done it this way, because
Right.
that's what, you know. So
I've
what have
changed
you
many
changed?
things. I've changed
Tell
many
me
things.
some
Too long of a
things
list.
you've changed. Okay.
Too long of a list.
The
I've
big
changed
one.
many things.
The big one that
The
you've
big thing
changed.
that I did is I took Torah reading away from Friday night and put it in Saturday morning.
Okay.
Again, deeply rooted
Oh, look,
in
everyone
Jewish
goes,
law.
yeah, we remember that one.
Right. Deeply rooted in
The whole
Jewish law.
Friday- the whole
Didn't
Friday-
make
the whole
Friday night
is
shorter.
different.
Right.
The whole Friday night.
The whole Friday night service liturgy is different, right?
The music is
Um,
different.
Right. Those sort of decisions are made, and certainly
And
with
when
things
you
like
did that,
yes,
clearly, because you make that decision, you talk to the board, and you're like, let's see, and there wasn't, clearly it's a year now,
Mhm.
so if it hadn't worked, you would have heard it long and loud.
even if it does work, I would have heard it loud. But
That's right.
no, what you're referring to is the fact that when these things would happen, one, I would always write about them
Yeah.
to the entire congregation to tell you why. Right? You deserve to know why I'm changing something. Nothing's up to me specifically, and nothing's up to the board specifically. I want to tell you my suggestion, and the board has trusted me to say, okay, let's roll with it. Let's see how it goes. I assume there will be things, or there might be things where the board says, we're not ready, no, or just no, and that's okay, right? In terms of the changes that we have made, you know, just as, even if it's as simple as the music or something like that. One thing that I always remind people is the way that you've always done it a year from now, right? People, I love it when people say, why don't you do that new Hashkivenu anymore? I love that. I was playing it for three months, right? Well, for 20 years before that, you'd never heard it, right? But now it's your Hashkivenu, right? The way you've always done it becomes yours. Tradition is built that way, right? That's why we change, right? If we were to say, well, this is it, this is what we're comfortable, whatever it is, we'd never get anywhere. Some changes work, some don't. But the changes that work, and I think they are working, at least most of them, are now becoming custom here at Temple Israel, and it's wonderful to see that transformation.
And I
Yes.
wouldn't say that you've changed, except for that example, I wouldn't say, in my opinion, that you've changed as much as
Yeah.
you've added to.
Yeah,
You've introduced new things that we
Yeah.
didn't previously do.
right.
But in terms of actual change, I think that was really.
That was a big one. Yeah, that was a big one.
Yeah.
But now we have, you know, everyone's for it. We've,
But that's been the case for every time we've had a change
Yeah.
in the rabbinic leadership. There have been changes
Right.
in the way things have been done.
Yeah.
right.
Because interpretations are different, or, as you say, the needs change, or whatever. And in almost all cases, I mean, one thing I point to all the time is when we came here, there was an organ.
Right.
Well, as soon as we walked in and said, oh my God, are we in a Jewish service or are we in a Christian service? It was the organ. Well, the organ disappeared before very long.
Right.
Okay? A little bit of piano music is not the same as a lot of organ music.
Or guitar.
Right.
Or
Right.
your form.
And that was a total shock.
Right. I'd imagine, right.
Well, but the choir was only for the high holidays.
Yeah.
And although it was the members of the choir were all Christian, they were singing
Wow.
Jewish melodies and Hebrew,
Oh, cool.
so, you know.
And I think you're right. I think what Deb's saying is the heart of what we've been talking about, right? Is every new rabbi that comes in, right, has that ideas of saying, well, this is actually what we feel is the authority. And there are things as blatant as changing. I mean, I grew up with an organ, okay, big, giant organ in Sharamith. It was huge, right? Right? When they brought in a guitar, I was young enough to say, hey, cool. But other people were not. Other people were not cool with that. Now, now you look at Reform Judaism. There's not an organ in sight. Actually, there's 2 congregations that kept it. But besides that, guitars are everywhere, right? So I'm hoping they stick with that because I know how to play guitar. If they move to another, we're like, oh, in terms of clarinet, I got to go back and learn.
Yeah.
But absolutely.
We're gonna have bagpipes.
Good. So we're at the bagpipes. Oh, goodness. Good. Okay. So I want to keep going because I want us to get in this part as well in these next 45 minutes. If you do need a stretch break, please feel free. I know
Okay,
it's a
what's
lot.
the newest food, what, I was thinking I was staying for, and I'm gonna stay for the next one,
Can
what's
you
the
get me a
difference?
drink?
This one is called Ideology and Allegory. This is,
Is that gonna be over my head?
no, nothing will be over your head.
Oh, Jan.
Nothing will be over your head.
I don't wanna think that hard, it's Sunday.
This is
No,
gonna,
listen, what did Jan was telling
this is
me-
gonna make you think critically.
Jan was
Well,
telling me
this
that
is
her-
a short introduction, so you can,
Oh, yeah,
you
okay.
can see how,
You decide if you want to come back next time. How's that? Yes, sorry.
Jan was
Yeah.
telling me that her grandmother didn't put the stones on the grave. So is that and I know all
We
about
didn't
that.
throw dirt
Is that a-
in
is
the
that a-
ground on top of the.
These are customs based on tradition.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
right?
that's
I mean,
that's just something Jews do, and no one knows why they do that.
I know
We
why they do it,
why,
but
how long have they been doing it?
how long they've been
Yeah,
doing it and
just-
where is going to be different,
Yeah.
right? Why we do it is important, and I hope that people do it and they know why. Those are very meaningful actions. But you're right, there may be congregations that say there are no, we use pine cones. You know what I mean? Like that's as simple as it could be, right? The dirt, right? Throwing the
Yeah,
dirt
we
and
didn't
things
do
like
soil,
that,
soil,
right?
soil.
Soil, thank you. Earth, actually. Earth and soil are the right terms, because it's not dirt.
And do you know-
You're absolutely right. I would have gotten in trouble for that. You're right. Earth and soil. Okay. So I do again apologize again for the shorten of this aspect. This will probably be a longer class than the first class because there's so much to talk about. But this will reference sort of from last year. If you were with me last year from the second class, what did I call it?
Allegory, something about allegory. And,
That's this one.
no, that was allegory too.
Really? Boy,
I
okay.
don't know. We looked at
Well,
the
whatever it
text.
was.
We looked at the text. Of
Right, it was very
the-
text heavy in the same way this will be text heavy. That's right. We're going to start to look at the Torah from this side of the learning from what's called a critical eye. Okay. Literary criticism from a literary piece of literature document. As I said before, last year, my role here is not to convince you of anything about the Torah. Okay, I want to give you as much information as possible. If you believe that the Torah came from Sinai and it is perfect, that is wonderful. If you believe that it was built throughout the generations and was edited and redacted and that sort of stuff, that's fine, great. We're going to look at it, though, either way, from that critical eye. We're going to remove a great deal of our, what I would say, rabbinic glasses, okay? The rabbis did a great job of answering your questions before you ask them. You understand what that means, right? You guys wear glasses in terms of, this is what I know is the answer, right? If someone were to ask you in Genesis, why do they say, let us create humans in our image? They have an answer for that. We're going to end without their answers. Does that make sense? Good. So why is it important to do so? It helps us understand these qualities as a non-historical narrative, okay? We're not going to take it literally. It's important to understand it in this way for this class, okay? Really important when we're doing this, we are not diminishing its value as a religious or cultural object. The argument about is the Torah holy if it is not divine? Yes, of course it's holy, but for different reasons, okay? Historical writing on history does not have a monopoly on meaning, okay? Nor is it the only way to describe reality, okay? We know that from reading history, right? The name history says it all, right? It's the story, it's his story, okay? Its sacredness. The Torah is sacred. Does it undermine the Torah's sacredness? No. Does the notion that the text is altogether human in origin undermine its sacredness? No. There are plenty who would argue with me, and many who do, that without some divine origin or intervention, someone called it an intellectual exercise. Okay? It would be a great work of literature. It would be Shakespeare. It would be Sophocles, right? If there was not some divine origin. I wholeheartedly disagree. Say we decide. We decide what's holy and what's not. And we decide why. You cannot simply be holy passively. And this goes back to the last conversation. The why behind it. Why are you holy? Simply by existing is not enough. Why is it sacred to you? Why is it holy to you? Okay? In terms of literature, and we're going to talk about from a literary point of view, it's important to look at this the way we did last year in terms of genre, and we're going to talk about all of that, okay? An act of literature acts based on how it's received. Who reads it? What status it's put on in each community, okay? The Torah is one of the few that created a people. And that, to me, is what makes it holy. It created Judaism. There would be no distinguishing between the Canaanites. If you look at the archaeological evidence between Israelite pottery and Canaanite pottery, it's the same. The Torah is what made us different. Okay? Certainly, the fact that it is something doesn't necessarily mean it's great. Make great works, we've lost. And there are that have been published that are mediocre at best. The fact that it exists does not mean that it's holy and sacred and great. I'm talking in general, not about the Torah. I'm talking about books in general, okay? The great books that probably did not get published, and there are probably some not so great books that are bestsellers, okay? That does not particularly make them meaningful, okay, in terms of how many people read them. So if we are viewing Torah as a literary document, in this case, why are we studying it? Why should Jews study Torah in general? It is one of our main commandments, really, to study Torah. Certainly, Torah is thousands and thousands of years old and has been a dynamic force in building Western society, right? Judaism, Christianity, and Islam would not exist without it. So we cannot say that Western, or Eastern society would be the same without it. It is part of a canon. It has achieved canonical status. That's an important reason to do something. It's made it into the canon. It has created cultures, all different denominations and different kinds, cultures and cultural trends. And most importantly, it's our obligation in this generation to read it, because the generation before us read it differently, and the generation read it differently. It's our role in this century, in our generation, to read it the way we read it. Read Shakespeare differently, right? Interpreted this way, some scholars think that way, right? There are certain things that are certainly understood all the way around, but who you are as a people in your culture defines how you understand things. Really important is this next line, friends. And it goes to what we said in the last part. We have no obligation to receive Torah the way any previous generation. That's real. Our parents and our grandparents and Jews 1,000 years ago read and studied Torah. That's great. It was great for them. Society at this time, in this culture, we're going to read it the way that's best for us. We have no obligation to receive it the way that they did. There's no meaning in that. We did not stand at Sinai, if you believe it came from Sinai. We still read it, but that doesn't in that way. Literature to function. It's interpreted the most creative or critical tools available, meaning what are some unexplored meanings that we might find? Or what are some needs that we have that the other generations didn't have? Meaning, when you read something, our generation might need something from Torah that the last generation didn't. Or they may have needed something that we don't, right? If you read a book that you've read 30 years ago and you read it now, you'll probably read it differently. Mm-hmm. You'll see things you didn't see. You'll care about characters you didn't care about. You'll relate to things that you didn't relate to. It's the same way with Torah. Torah is not unchanging for everybody. The way is because that's the way we read Torah today. And when I teach this course in 20 years, when you guys have forgotten it, I will make this argument again, that we are reading Torah differently than we read it before, okay? No matter what, when we pick up a book or pick up any text, okay, you engage in your own, what we call interpretive strategy. You may not know that you're doing it, but you are. This is your background. It's like what it says, an operating system on a computer, okay? The way you incorporate things, your brain receives and then chooses a strategy to interpret. Today, you will interpret things, a 21st century Jew will interpret things differently than the brain of someone 100 years ago, right? The strategy that they will use to interpret it will be different. If we understand how important that is, it's not just the way we read it. The strategies our brains will use to interpret it will be different. That's how different it is. Okay?
Do you think
Yes.
that, are you implying that people's brains work differently today than they did 100
They
years
do.
ago? Okay.
They do.
Or is it also, is the way our brain works also informed by our frame of reference and our
I think both.
cultural, yeah.
That's it.
I think
Our
both.
experiences shape our
Yeah,
Correct.
interpretations.
yeah.
Right. The word I throw around a lot is cultural repertoire. What are you defined by your culture? And that's how your brain does it, right? Someone outside of our culture would not interpret it the same way that we do, right? In that way, I guess it's okay to say the brain does not work the same way that we do, not in a negative way. Their culture shaped theirs and our culture shaped ours, okay? That's why you need people to translate when you're reading a book in another language or a book from 1,000 years ago. It kills me when people say that they can read the Torah today without anything and they'll understand it the way. No, they can't. They don't have the tools necessary to do it. Okay? And we'll talk about that more. The person who finds the comment, here's the example. You'll need a screwdriver and a wrench. Among the assembly instructions for a bicycle, it is not expected to seek out deep ironic meanings. Sometimes things are things. Okay? You need a screwdriver and a wrench, not why. Sometimes you need it to fix the bike. Okay? When we talk to small children, our strategy is different. I've learned this quite recently. You speak to them differently because you know that they will comprehend things differently. When we engage with our friends, we talk differently. When we engage with our students, we talk differently, and our teachers. We choose different strategies to interpret things. You don't interpret a 3-year-old would a 30-year-old's claims. You have a different strategy for that in the same way, okay? We talked last year about what we call literary trope, and we're going to talk about it again. every piece of literature gives you a signal. It pushes something in your brain to say, I know what this is from my experience, and I know what to do with it. I'll go down to genre and the constraints. If you read something that says once upon a time, your brain does not say, oh, great, this really happened. Your brain signals you to say, from what I understand, when I hear the words once upon a time, it's a fairy tale. Law. It has not really happened, and you know that automatically, at least in English. What's important is that when we read the Torah, I want to give you the tools to do the same thing. Okay? When you look at a piece of Torah, you don't know the signals yet. You don't know what you're supposed to be feeling or thinking about that particular genre. And that is okay. It doesn't come automatically. At some point in your education, you learned that once upon a time triggers a fairy tale. It wasn't just inherently born with that idea. Okay? There is a type of genre. There's genres of art and music, but they retain certain characteristics that put them in a category. Okay, for the most part. You can distinguish between science fiction and nonfiction and romantic and comedy. There are different signals that you'll get. There are different interpretations that you'll use, okay? A formal lecture, a comic strip, a text message, you read them all differently. Hopefully you do, okay? But you do automatically most of the time, okay? The one thing that we're going to be trying to do throughout this class is, again, to give you those tools to say, I know that. I see what that represents. The best example is in the Torah. You will hear, Vayidaber Adonai Moshe Lemor, and God said to Moses, saying. That is a trope signal that says law is about to come. You'll learn that, right? That's your once upon a time moment, okay? Or something like the idea of 40 days. 40 days is a signal to signify a long time, not 40 days, right? Things like that. These are the tools we need, okay? Yeah.
So not to take it literally.
Sure. No, right? But if you're reading, right, what's a fairy tale? Cinderella, right? And you don't have the tools necessary. You're going, oh my goodness, what a horrible story. Who is this guy? Who is this woman? When did this happen? Right? Where's the glass slipper? Right? I mean, those aren't the right questions to ask. That's really important, right? Are you asking the right questions when you're reading the Torah? Or are you asking questions that are away from the genre constraint that it's in? This is where it gets really cool, guys, friends. Think about reading something in that way, right? Because you just didn't know what the signals were, because you haven't been taught the signals, unless you've been with me for last year. You learned some of them, right? But you need to, in order to fully understand and grasp this piece of literature. Otherwise, you're missing out, right? You're not seeing what you could be seeing, okay? Good. Genres are always shifting, okay? This is, again, about creativity. There's a book from 1864 called The Female Detective. If it was written today, okay, so in 1864, a female lead book was a genre constraint starting to not be so constrained.
Well, at least a female detective would have been.
Sure.
In other.
Right, a female detective lead, right, exactly.
Yeah, or she would be a romantic character.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. The role that they would have,
Yeah.
right, would be surprising to someone in 1864.
Yeah.
Right? I want you, when you're looking at Torah, to say, this should surprise me or this shouldn't, based on that culture. Right? You need to get in the head of the Israelite writer or author and say, is this crazy or is this perfectly right? Right? Because the way that we're looking at it doesn't matter. Right? If someone teaches you that in 1864 it was rare to see a female detective, you don't say, I don't care, that's not what I see. I think it's fine now. Well, that takes away from the author, it takes away from the reaction, it takes away from the culture. Eventually, friends, nothing is new. Okay? Eventually. something is no longer new. You just have to get there, okay? In terms of, if we turn the page, genre shifts, okay? There are sub aspects, okay? Genre hybrids and things like that. It is your choice as an author of romance to decide if the main character lives happily ever after or not, okay? That is something that fits within the genre constraint. It shifts. A twist in a movie, okay? To say, oh, that's not what I'm used to watching. That's weird. They're trying to show you, okay? The Torah does that too, okay? I think it's fair to say everything's subjective. Your judgment is subjective. It is. It's very, very hard to be objective about reading literature. You have your own spec go in, and your own understanding will work. That's why we love to study together. You're going to see something in this text that I haven't seen. Share it with me, please. Right? Your experiences shape you differently than mine. I am so full of scholarly whatever that you may see something that, I don't see, and vice versa. Okay? That's why we study together. That's why chavruta, the idea of studying in pairs or more, is so important to Judaism. If you read it alone, it's just you. I mean, you can learn things, but it's just you. If you learn in a group, you get to hear the other strategies, the other interpretations. Okay?
So our book groups are so cool.
Yeah, book groups, exactly.
Right, Debbie?
Exactly.
That's why book groups are so cool. You all bring your own.
A rather embarrassing typo. Should the story of, that's supposed to be Moses, not, I guess, Jose's.
Okay.
Boy, that one really shifted there. Okay, so many Jose's. The story of Moses, okay, as a second command in Egypt, be taken as a historically accurate portrayal of actual events, or was the story composed according to the constraints of what we might call fantasy genre? Meaning, is the Exodus a literary account of what happened, or is it meant to teach us something? It is possible both, okay, or either. Is Jacob wrestling at the river of Jabbok literally a confrontation with a divine being, an angel? Did that really happen? And even if it didn't happen, are we supposed to know it was an angel or not? Or is the symbolism really what's important? We will only know by using the tools and reading it. Yes?
So, Michael, would I be right in saying an ultra-Orthodox Jew would say, yes, it did happen?
Yes.
There was Jacob and the...
He was there.
All right.
And they wrestled.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
very conservative Catholics believe.
Correct. In
And-
the same way.
One of my sons, the youngest one, came home, he got into trouble from his teacher because he was 7 years old, and he said, but Noah's Ark, there wasn't actually an ark, and there wasn't actually two by two, and all hell broke
Right,
loose.
right.
And I had to tell Patrick, you need to be quiet. And you need to learn about
Sometimes if you're in that room, you have to stay quiet. And that is okay. But yes, an ultra-Orthodox person would say, of course this happened. If it didn't happen, why are we even reading it? Right? It doesn't fit with their strategy of interpretation. Okay? It's just an intellectual exercise. It's not a religion. Okay? Few of us, there are some, but few of us were able to pick up and read a play by Shakespeare without having our teacher there to help us and teach us how to read it. Okay? There might be some people who just intrinsically knew that English dialect and all his idiomatic expressions without a teacher helping you to understand it, right? Because they are outside of your cultural repertoire. We don't speak like that anymore. We don't use those, well, sometimes actually we do use those idiomatic expressions now, but we don't know where they came from there, okay? The narrative from the past, any past, is not likely to have anything in common with contemporary literary forms, okay? What I'm trying to say from a Torah point of view is when people say that the Torah is universal, when I say that the Torah, the things that we can continue to learn is universal. The way it's written literally is not universal. It was written for a particular people at a particular time for a particular reason. And we are not that people. We are now 21st century Jews who have to look at it differently. But I want you to know how to read it, the way they were supposed to read it. Yes, Steph?
And probably a good contemporary example would be the interpretation of the Constitution, where we have the literalists versus the more
Correct.
reformist views, where
Correct.
things change, interpretations change as the culture changes.
Correct.
Let's not even go there.
So, right, so that is the idea. Hi, guys. That is the idea, yes, that just because something was written down, or when something was written down, it was written for a particular audience. And if you're no longer that audience, don't pretend that you are, right? Things are different. Hi, guys. No, that's fine. That's fine.
Many of
You,
us
thank you.
know the Bible in English from the King James Version,
Oof.
which we think is very beautifully written.
Yeah.
Is it beautifully written in Hebrew as well?
You're asking a couple questions here. One, the Hebrew is vastly different from the English in many ways because of the restrictions of translation. Second, King James went on a variety of ways outside to make it beautiful, which do not keep it to the history, to the historical Hebrew of it. So it might be beautiful, that doesn't make it correct.
Sure, yeah.
Correct.
I just wondered,
Yes.
is it stirring in Hebrew as well?
The Bible is a gorgeous document at times. It is also horribly written in others.
Okay.
You just in the Hebrew,
Okay.
and you don't get to see that unless you're reading it in the Hebrew. Okay, there are sentences where you say that is a mess in the Hebrew. Something has to be wrong, and there are points where if you read it in Hebrew, you start to cry.
Okay.
So yes, absolutely. Translation's a whole nother problem. We'll get to that too. Okay. So the idea of that translation that we're talking about of culture to culture, you need someone to translate Shakespeare to you. Okay, you need a teacher to help you do that. If you were to read it alone, you might come up with a couple things that maybe are right. But you need someone who understands the history of the culture at the time to tell you what they were writing about and why, in order for you to feel what that author wanted their audience to feel. Otherwise, we miss what that author wants us to feel, okay? If you read the Torah, you might think some beautiful things that reflect how you live today. Don't they? But when we're studying it from a critical eye, I want you to read it the way an Israelite would have read it, or someone hearing in Persia, reading it being stated on the street corner from the prophet, understand what it meant at the time. Okay, and both are important. It is always important to have things mean something to you because they will. You can't help it. Something will hit you in a way that this reflects me personally. That's great, but it's not critical looking at a literary point of view. So we're going to focus on the latter more than the former. Okay. In some contexts, we are fooled into believing that our tools are adequate for giving an interpretive process, even when they are inadequate. A person who tells you you can read the Torah by yourself and understand everything is not giving you the tools necessary. They are lying to you. You don't have those tools inherently. You need them, okay? A Christian who reads the Bible through the Christian lens is using Christian tools. A Jew who reads the Bible is using Jewish tools, okay? We cannot be convinced that they are the same. They're not. And they might not be adequate, right? The way that a biblical scholar reads something is different than a layperson will read it, okay? In terms of levels of adequacy and inadequacy. And there's nothing wrong with it. You're not inherently born with the idea to be a biblical scholar, right? So you may be looking at a piece of paper with lines on it and say, I'm not adequate enough to interpret this the right way, at least from a literary criticism point of view, okay? A false sense of confidence, Jules, is particularly common when we read them in translation. Everything makes sense in English, right? And if they don't, then they write it beautifully in the King James Version to match, to make it look beautiful. But that is not, you are getting a false sense of confidence there. If you read the prophetic works in English, you're getting a false sense of confidence as to what it really is saying. You're going to get some of it. It's beautiful in some of it in English. but you do not have the tools necessary to understand everything, the nuances in Hebrew that you might be missing. Okay?
But when we read, when God created man in his own image,
Yeah.
that's the English. Is that does the Hebrew sound?
Not necessarily, no. But again, even translation, right, is subjective. A Christian translator says, of course this means this. A Jewish translator says, no, it means this, right? And you may think it means this, or I may think it means this if I'm translating, right? We have subconscious and unconscious and conscious ways of saying, putting your own agenda in everything in terms of translation, okay? You can still read translation, just make sure that you understand how you're reading it, right? The Bible isn't clear, the translator is, okay? So that's why you need a translator to interpret those meanings, okay? I think I've said this just a moment ago, but if you are reading something with a false sense of confidence, you are resulting in an impoverished reading experience. I don't want you to do that. I want you to be able to say, did you know what this really meant? Right? I want you to be able to do that. Do you believe a translator can adequately capture the meanings of a text in a foreign language? Have any of you guys had to translate a word in a foreign language and had to say, there's no real equivalent sentence to do? The translators have to find a word to do that, which means it might not be exactly right, okay? Hebrew is exactly the same way. Hebrew is a loaded language of interpretation, where you can say it might mean this, it might mean this, right? Last year we talked about the difference when it went from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English. That is the worst game of telephone you can ever play, because every language has its own interpretation and word for something that creates an agenda, okay? But again, it's about what you're looking to do. Are you looking for life meanings? Are you looking on how to set up a congregation? Or are you just reading to check it out? Your motivation for opening the Torah changes what you're looking for, okay? Finally, Terry Eagleton said the great majority of people believe without knowing that they do. We could probably talk about that one all day, okay? Belief without knowledge. Belief without knowledge is living within a culture without consciously reflecting upon the constraints, customs, and structures that compromise it, okay? You need that other part to help guide you in the right belief structure. If you don't have that, then you're just making stuff up, okay?
A lot of that going around.
It might be nice. It might be a great interpretation, but it's yours, right? That, friends, is ideology, your ideology, okay? Again, I am apologizing for ending early, but next week, what we're going to be doing in this class, in 2 weeks, rather, I guess the last week in October, we're going to open up the book of Genesis, friends, and what we're going to do is to find the ideology inside of it. Ideologies, frankly, okay? We are going to look at the book. We're going to take off those rabbinic sunglasses, okay? We're going to forget those things that were put in your head in religious school, okay? We're going to forget what the last rabbi said, okay? We're going to look at the text from the tools that we will provide in terms of who is it written for and what were they supposed to get out of it? And what does that mean to you today? Okay? If we read Genesis 1 and you believe it to be a literary document of the creation of the world, with all due respect, you're missing the point. There are other creation stories. Even in our Tanakh, there are other creation stories. This is a particular one for a particular meaning. If you believe that the sea split and we marched through and there were plagues in Egypt, you're missing the point of the story from the author's point of view. Okay? Again, you can believe what you like to believe, but I want to give you the opportunity to read it in the way it was supposed to be received, if that makes sense. Okay? Questions about where we are going about what we will be doing. Jan, that didn't seem over your head, did it?
No, I just had this image of when you get the cliff notes on a story and get that to think about, but that's the, yeah.
Right, and that's actually really nice, Jen. If people would say reading the Cliff Notes is cheating, right? But what they're doing in those little paragraphs is say, okay, what he's really saying is this. You need to tell the teacher that's what he's saying, right? Because you wouldn't see it unless you studied and the teacher would tell you, right? The Cliff Notes are those tools. They're not really giving you the tools. They're giving you the answers, right? By using the tools. That's really what the Cliff Notes is.
I think all of this has always been, to me, more of a message is trying to get across. It's not the story, it's the impact or message or things to think about and ponder, yeah.
It's the ideology and the allegory. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I think that's important, and I want you to be able to, we're all very creative about the things that we think about and the way that we interpret and things like that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I'll give you an example. My dad, a few years ago, was talking to me about Genesis for some reason, probably because he knew I was a rabbi. And he just talks about this stuff. And he said, maybe, Mike, I think that the word for day in Genesis meant another span of time. And if it were 7 days, or whatever it is. And I said, that's really nice, but that's not true at all. Here's the reason that it was this way, right? He would not have known that unless, when I say the real reason, it's not the real reason. Here's what the scholars, in terms of biblical criticism, suggest, right? From understanding the word yom in day and understanding the time when it was written and who it was written for. But there's nothing wrong with sort of playing with that idea of saying maybe. The last thing I'll mention is what one of my teachers always told me, is that if you ask me the question, is it possible? The answer is always yes. Yes, it's possible. I have stuff to suggest otherwise, but I can't say if it is not or if it is. Is it possible that blah, blah? Yeah, yes.
It's possible.
It's possible, right? Let's study to find out how, but it is possible. Everything is possible in this sort of study because we're not there. We don't have everything. We have the end result. We have the Torah. We have the Talmud. We have the Masoretic text, and we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we don't have everything. And we don't have the authors with us. So is it possible? Yes, it's possible. That's always the best part to think about in terms of these classes. Okay?
Well, and the individual interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And that, going back to our first class, I think that's, to me, one of the things that's wonderful about Reform Judaism is that we're all allowed to have our own interpretation.
You are. You're not, that's exactly right. When you say you're allowed, I will never tell you, no, you can't think that. You can think whatever you want. It's your choice. I will suggest perhaps another way to think about it, and you make that decision on how to do it. That's exactly what we do, okay? Friends, again, I apologize for running out to the Vesper service. Next time, we will go straight to 4:30 to our friends who came late. I'm sorry. We had to come early. I apologize. Next time, we will go straight to 4:30 from 3:15. Today is just the outlier.
Okay.
Dan,
I'm sorry, Deb, sorry.
because in the first class, could you put it